Yeah, what's cracking, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of Prison Break Raw. I'm your host, the one and only Big JD. Go ahead, get this channel, subscribe, share at least some messages or comments, hit the thumbs up for the like, notification bell to be informed on all episodes when they drop, and most importantly, if you enjoy this content, please feel free to share it. Sharing is caring. Get the word out, share it to your family, your friends, your coworkers, anywhere and everywhere in your social media platforms. Let's get this raw and uncut material out there to the millions that don't know we are here. This one right here is an interesting topic that I've been working on with a little bit of research and personal knowledge and experience with how music influences gang culture and gang life and gangs in general. And when we think of that, we think of like rap music, like gangster rap. That's what it's called. That was called in the 90s. That was the genre of a specific kind of rap music geared towards the gang life, shooting them up and running amok and doing all that stuff. Now it's a lot of individual rappers these days. The music is still geared towards that kind of like that feel, that vibe, but it's not really considered gangster rap, not like it was in the 90s. But what about other kinds of music? How has their influence affected like gang life and gangs themselves? We're going to get into some interesting points that I bet a lot of you don't really know about all of these things, but you do know about some of them, because one of them is pretty recent, over I would say the last maybe 20 years. But a lot of these ones span all the way back to the 80s, and some of this music influence even goes all the way back to the 1960s. With just certain names of songs and how they've been turned into nicknames in various different varieties and even African-American gangs and even some European-American gangs. All that stuff. So, in the 1980s, the punk scene was pretty much not so much on its decline, but it was because it actually took back off again in the early 90s, but it just kind of leveled off again. But in the 80s, in the early 80s, punk was pretty much at its height. And you had a lot of different local bands that were coming out of Los Angeles. One in particular out of Venice Beach was a band called the Suicidal Tendencies. Now, they really started out in the 70s, but they moved out, they pretty much took off in the 1980s. Now, the Suicidal Tendencies didn't really look like punk rockers if you really looked at them. They looked like cholos. I mean, Mike Muir, the lead singer, had his hat flipped up like that, bandana over his eyes, one button up, cut off dicky shorts with white socks up to his knees, wearing house slippers and all that. He did all that. Not only did he wear house slippers, but he wore skater shoes because a lot of these cats, Venice Beach is called Dogtown, for some of you that don't know. It's been called that for a very long time. And a lot of the skater scene came out of Venice Beach. A lot of these kids that took it from there and made it what it is, and it just caught wind all over the world. But the skating scene took off out of Venice, and a couple of these cats that were in that scene had actually started to get into the suicidal tendencies type of a theme of punk rock. Like I said, they didn't look like punkers at all when you looked at them. Big old baggy dicky shorts, Pendletons, bandana on their head just barely over their eyes. Some of them wore hairnets. Some of them you couldn't even tell that they were punk rockers because they were completely choloed out. We're talking shiny shoes, the pants all pulled up, tucked in, buttons all the way up, slick back hair, the whole nine. Now, the Suicidal Tendencies had actually developed a fan base to the point to where these fans started identifying themselves as suicidals. These suicidals became a gang, a righteous street gang, jumping people in and all of that stuff. They did shootings, they did stabbings, they had rumbles with other neighborhoods. They put it in. Now, this Suicidals gang out of Venice Beach, because this is where it pretty much started, wasn't exactly like Chicanos, but it was poor whites or poor European Americans and Chicanos together, and there was even some African Americans in that gang itself. There was actually an African American that was in the Suicidal Tendencies himself. So this was the gang. Suicidals. And later on, this gang, the Suicidals gang, had branched out into Whittier, Long Beach, Fullerton, Orange County, further out into the Hollywood area. And it kept the attire, the look, and everything pretty much the exact same way. The cholo, everything, the way they talked, the way they acted, the way they moved. Me personally, I was first exposed to the Suicidals gang when I was 14 years old and I was a runaway. When I was running around out in the streets, I hooked up with this cat, and I talk about him in my upcoming book. When I release that book, I'll let you know. But his name was Ramo, and he was like an idol to me, man. He was the epitome of cool. He was, pushing that weight. He was with the business. He was straight suicidal out. You looked at him, you would think that he was just like a cholo. He was actually a Colombian dude, but he slicked his hair back. He dressed real sharp, and he was always with the Pendletons and the Dickies and either the Chuck Taylors or the Cortezes or whatever it was. That was the common look back then. But a lot of these suicidals, it looked kind of funny to see them because they'd be on a skateboard and they'd be skating half pipes, skating the emptied out pools and all that, looking straight gang banged out. And a lot of times you knew a suicidal by who they are because in their bill they put suicidal in there, just like Mike Muir, the lead singer, did. So this gang branched out into Orange County, and it was the Orange County Suicidals that I originally got exposed to. And honestly, I was actually almost going to get jumped in to the Suicidals because I was hooked up with them so tough, and I rocked with them on many different occasions. Did a lot of things together. After I finally went back home after running away through all the ordeal and everything I went to, I basically started hanging around with them again and just got into a whole bunch of shit. But then a lot of them started going to jail. Another one got killed besides the one that I mentioned in my book. And a lot of things started happening. And I just kind of pulled away from that and just stuck with my little crew. Now, at the same time, back in these days, a lot of this gangster rap was starting to take shape. Like NWA, was out there. DJ Quick was just coming out. You had Ice-T. They'd put out the song Colors, and a lot of this music was influencing a lot of our young minds. And back then, it was much different. A lot of people think that it was more racist back then than it is now. Actually, I believe it's more racist now than it was then. Because when we were running around in the streets, I got to tell you, and my dad even made a slick comment about this one time. In my crew that I ran around with, a lot of times it was because a lot of gang members, unless you're established in the greater LA area or South Central LA, Compton, Watts, place like that, East LA, if you're from a family that's living in apartments type of thing, you're not actually living in a physical house, most of the time this is how gangs spread. Because families will live in apartments until their lease is up, or if they can't pay the bill, they'll get evicted and they'll move somewhere else to some other cheap, low-budget apartments and get mixed in with all these other families that are doing the same thing. In a lot of these apartments, like City Terrace, you had the El Dorado. It was actually like a weekly that was in Orange County. You had various other places in the city of Norwalk and whatnot. The Manors over there in the city of Norwalk, where a bunch of different gangs from all over the place went, and it caused a lot of problems when they started the Manor Boys over there in the city of Norwalk. So families getting in these apartments together and from all races, poor, like I said, poor European Americans, poor Chicanos, poor blacks, all that shit. And a couple of my boys that I knew back then were Crips. And I had a homie who was from a barrio in Compton. He was from a gang called CVS, Compton Barrio Segundo. And then there was another cat that used to kick it with us. He was from a gang in Buena Park called Coyotes. And we all used to hang out together. And then we had this little white dude. His name was Danny. And he was kind of like a little white Crip. So it was kind of like a mixed bag of different things. And we also had this Filipino dude who was from a gang called Santanaz. And we all used to hang out together. We were young, man. We were like 14, 13, 14, 15 years old. And it was always funny to see it, but it wasn't uncommon back then. Back then, there wasn't a lot of the racial tension that there is now. A lot of black gangs and Chicano gangs, depending on like their location, pretty much got along, didn't really have a whole lot of beef. When you go out to like East LA, there wasn't so much of that. There was just mostly just straight, Mexican Chicano gangs, whatnot. Very, very few blacks, if any, were out there. So this punk rock type / cholo gang, the Suicidals, was moving around just like any of the rest of these families. Low budget apartments, maybe a single mom or parents that are just very low income, so they bounce around from apartments to apartments to apartments all over the place, and their influence started to spread. They didn't really like blow up like another one that we'll be talking about in a minute, but they did a lot of moving around. And they influenced a lot of things, and they picked up a lot of other influences, and as the time went on, they started to adopt more of just a straight moving away from punk and going straight into like this whole gangster scene. Now, these Suicidals in Orange County had problem with every skinhead gang that was in Orange County because of the fact they were what's considered to be a hybrid gang, or some people like to call them a Bellaton gang, multi-different races. So that didn't sit too well with a lot of the skinhead gangs that were in Orange County. Did various different groups. Used to go at it with them. One that I know that was common, that was always battling with the Suicidals, was War Skins. But there was also another punk music influenced gang that started mostly with middle class, low middle class white kids, and it was called the Lads, LA Death Squad. Right now, the Lads did a lot of the same things the Suicidals did. Looked the same, took the whole cholo image, the Dickies, the Pendletons, the flipped up hat, but instead of putting Suicidal below their brim, they would put Lads. And they were influenced a lot by the Hollywood punk rock scene, and then they started moving out towards like the areas of Venice and Huntington Beach, even some places, Orange County, and Long Beach. So they used to have a lot of beef with these Suicidals. They used to go at it with each other all the time. I remember actually having a bunch of dudes from the Lads run up on me after a night at Knott's Berry Farm when I was with one of these Suicidals, and it turned pretty vicious, man. It was a pretty good ass whooping. So yeah, the Lads were influenced by the punk music scene, and the Suicidals is same way. Now, in this day and age, fast forwarded about 20 years later, you have another band or music group that came out called the Insane Clown Posse. And I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with the Insane Clown Posse. And their fan base had actually developed a gang centered around them as their fan base, and they called themselves Juggalos. Now, this is like common knowledge. This is where everybody's like, we know what you're talking about. This ain't nothing new. This ain't new news. This ain't something we didn't know about already. You know about them because this is in your time frame. But you probably didn't know that about the Suicidals or the Lads, because they were influenced by, one was influenced just by the punk scene in general out in the Hollywood area and whatnot, and even, they spent a lot of time going to like Fender's Ballroom and Whiskey A Go-Go, places like that, and it was always problems. But the Juggalos, whole nother ball of wax. Right? Painted faces, their main color is red. And if you were to ask a Juggalo, like, what they gravitate more towards, they like to say they're up under the Bloods, and they like to say that they're a part of some kind of, like, Blood Nation or whatnot. And they wear a lot of red. They always say whoop, whoop, and all that. I know a lot of Juggalos in the city of Amarillo. I've talked to several of them. And they're a gang, and they're classified in Department of Homeland Security as being a righteous street gang. Not really a street gang, but a gang. And they're influenced by Insane Clown Posse, and that's their whole get down is surrounding around the Insane Clown Posse. Now, those are three circumstances right there. I'm sure there's plenty more. But these are the three main ones that I know about. Also, what I can tell you as fact, and I may not have a complete list of all of these names, but if you ever wondered why, like if you think of like old school like homies like Cholos and stuff in the 80s and 90s, you had like Shadow, Night Owl, Lonely, Sad Girl, those kinds of names. Sly, Slick, even Wicked, different names, Shotgun. I bet you didn't know that those names all come from music. They come from oldies. There's an old song out there that's called Night Owl. There's also another one that's called I'm a Shadow. You got, of course, Lonely Girl. Hey there, Lonely Girl. And Lonely Girl could be for Lonely Girl or Lonely Boy. You also have Sad Girl, which is another song, another oldie. Shotgun is that old song, Shotgun, comes from that, from what I'm understanding. Then, of course, you have Sly, the Slick, and the Wicked, which is a band. And those names were taken from there, and a lot of homies adopted those names. There's probably many other ones, but a lot of those nicknames were influenced from music, from the oldies. Just the same way as there was many different mobsters or gangsters in the 1920s, even as far back, whose nicknames were influenced by cartoons. Now, this also is interesting to point out that a lot of names, a lot of homies' names were also influenced by cartoons. You know, you got like Sleepy, Dopey, Grumpy, come from the dwarves, right? And like Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, even the Smurfs influenced a lot of these names. But you got names like Bugs Bunny, Bugsy, influence the names. Somebody that's got, buck teeth. Woody, usually given to a white homie or something like that that grew up with Juggalos. Woody Woodpecker, get my drift? Peckerwood. So the nickname Woody comes from that cartoon as well. So it's just interesting to point out how, like, these names influence gangs and how these bands, especially punk bands, had actually influenced gang activity without them, like, probably really even considering how it was going to turn out. Juggalo is the same thing. And like I said, I'm sure there's probably plenty more. And yeah, that's just what it is, man. It's interesting to point this stuff out, to know the history of all this. But I've been given bits and pieces of it over the years, and I thought I would share it with you. I thought it'd be an interesting point to make. So I hope you've enjoyed this video. Go ahead and check out the info in the introduction of this video. You'll find my PayPal information. You'll also find the Cash App information. You'll find links to find my books. Dear Mom, Dear Son, Separated by Bars, Not the Heart, and An Imprisoned Mind. And be on the lookout. We are going to be invading BitChute with Tinfoil Hat TV, and that's where we're going to take the conspiracy stuff. And we're also going to be getting up on Patreon. So there it is in a nutshell. Music influencing gangs, and it's still doing it to this day. Prison Break Raw, uncut, uncensored, no holds barred, not sugarcoated, not politically correct, all up in your face, slapping you with that dick of reality, and I'm out.